Hello, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to come and speak to you today. I'm sure from quite far away, for many of you listening in Hong Kong, to an introduction into facial depiction for identification. I'm an artist collaborating with Amy Chan on the Interface project, and this is a brief introduction to how we think about the face in terms of identity and identification, specifically within the practice of forensic art, which is more accurately known as forensic facial imaging. But I'll also make some reference to some interesting artistic projects that enable us to think in quite a challenging way about the assumptions we might make about the significance and the potency of the human face. Just to give you an idea of where I'm orientated, I've spent the last 5 years at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, where I was conducting PhD research into forensic art, as well as contributing to the design and the delivery of an MA program, a master's program in art and science, which is now in its 5th year of being offered. At the same time, I am also senior lecturer in visual arts at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, where I'm now back in my post. I took an extended leave to go and do my work in the UK. And now that I'm back here, I'm starting in the very early stages of establishing something which I'm calling VisLab, which is a 3D imaging research group that focuses on the face, but probably not exclusively. I'm interested in looking at how new imaging technologies can assist us with both the communication of scientific ideas and bridge the gap between art and science. A little bit more about me, because I think it's important to understand what a peculiar career choice, perhaps, it is to be a forensic artist, and especially one that is pursuing this work within a research environment or an academic environment. So I've kind of got one foot in the arts, one foot in the sciences, but altogether I operate within the space of academic research. So I'm based in Cape Town in South Africa, which is where that red dot is, right at the southern tip of the world, it seems. And I started my education following a fine arts program at the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS, in the mid to late 1990s. And between the year 2000 and 2012, I established a career as an artist and a curator. I won major awards, I had very prominent gallery representation, and I established an international profile, exhibiting pretty much on every continent on the globe, except for probably Greenland. But somehow this wasn't enough. And I was interested I had a long-standing interest in what I at that stage referred to as forensic aesthetics. I was interested in the visual culture of investigation and how we communicate truth or accuracy through visual images. And we can see that enacted, say, in a court of law, where demonstrative evidence might be brought to support or refute a particular claim. And obviously forensic art was an obvious pathway, but not that obvious, because you can't actually study forensic art academically anywhere in the world except for in Scotland. People enter forensic art usually by first becoming a police officer and then training on the job, as it were. So I was curious about this. I discovered a program at the University of Dundee. I was accepted into that program, and really, as they say, the rest is history. I went from Cape Town to Scotland. I then came back to Cape Town for a period and then went back to Liverpool to do the PhD. And in that time, I've done various internships, exchanges, and continuing professional development training in forensic laboratories in Turkey, in Korea. I've worked in the USA with forensic artists, in Australia, and so on. So this work can take you to very interesting places. It also has enabled me to engage with a whole range of different people, and I refer to as a community of practice. So the people that I engage with now as a facial imaging expert are quite different to those I used to engage with as an artist. I try and keep some fluidity between these two worlds, but largely this little list on the screen now of professional associations and affiliations gives you some idea both of the relevance of this work to a range of related fields, but also, most importantly, that there isn't one professional organization that supports forensic artists. So it's quite difficult in that respect, in that there are no agreed global standards of practice, etc. It's a complicated field, but complicated for me is what makes things interesting. Let's think a little bit about the face, identity, and identification. We see the face in relation to these two concepts of identity and identification pretty much all around us, so much so that we might take it for granted. So we'll see facial images in mugshots, for example, when people get arrested. And I've included some pretty famous faces in those mugshots. I think we have a particular interest in celebrity mugshots. We might then also see faces on any form of identification card, whether it's your passport. In this case, and we carry a smart card in South Africa, which is our national identity document. This verifies that we are who we say we are. We can also see the face increasingly used in increasingly sophisticated facial recognition technology. These facial algorithms no longer are the domain of sophisticated police investigations. Our social media uses these to enable us to tag, friends and family in photographs we might upload. And that should raise some questions in our minds about privacy and what is being done with this information, and how are these facial recognition systems being trained, to the point now where our face is used to unlock our smartphones, depending on the model of smartphone we have. There's also a lot of information that the face can tell us. It sends out signals, I would say, about our age, our health, our emotion, how we wish to present ourselves. These are obviously not always very reliable, and it's important to recognize that the way in which we perceive faces is also largely shaped by implicit bias. We carry implicit bias with us that to some extent originates in basic survival instincts, but in some cases has become culturally shaped in such a way that we might feel some conscious or unconscious prejudice towards certain people based on how they present their face to us. And we should really think very seriously about this. The face also, we might want to alter our faces because for whatever reason, it doesn't, in our minds, conform to what society thinks is beautiful, for example. So we might have eyelid surgery or rhinoplasty, a nose job. Sometimes these interventions are purely cosmetic, and sometimes they're actually functional and very important to enable us to actually chew our food properly, etc. However, we can also play with the face, and the face as the vehicle by which we communicate our identity to the world. So someone like RuPaul has made the art of drag internationally famous, where he may present as male presenting on one day and then female presenting on another day. This obviously translates into transgender individuals as well, where people might transition from their biological birth sex into a gender that better conforms with their sense of self. We can also see the face undergoing quite significant transformation, perhaps due to illness, so either congenital conditions or to disease, tumors, etc. Sometimes we alter our facial appearance according to ritual beliefs and practices. I'm particularly fond of that photograph of a very corporate-looking Maori man with a full face tattoo. I really like the juxtaposition of the face tattoo and the very conservative dress. We might also engage in radical body modification, which could alter our facial appearance extremely dramatically. However, we might also be born with facial difference that could affect how we are viewed in the eyes of society. So an organization, one example is an organization in the UK called Changing Faces, where they have established a Face Equality Day, and they really promote the rights of those who are either born with facial difference or who acquire facial difference through injuries such as burns, and to address the social stigma associated with faces that, in whichever way, don't conform to what our social norms consider normal. And I use normal in big inverted commas because personally I don't really believe in normal. This was the difference between faces, or the similarity between faces, was quite wonderfully demonstrated by the artist Ulrich Collett, who made a series of genetic portraits. You can find these online. And here he took photographs, portraits of people, and split the images down the middle, and then put the left and right halves together. And in this case, pairing up cousins Justine and Ulrich. So the face, as we're looking at the screen, the face on our right-hand side, that is the artist, Ulrich Collett, squished up with his cousin Justine, and then with his son, Nathan, who's 7. And that's really interesting because you can see in the difference in age, you can start to see how faces grow and develop with age, because obviously Nathan's face is a juvenile face, it's not a mature face, but the likeness is still there. And then twins, probably identical twins, Laurence and Christine, on the right-hand side. But this is a really fascinating series, and if you're interested in looking at this and the idea of the genetic similarity and genetic difference, which we'll get to again right at the end of this presentation, I encourage you to Google this project by Ulrich Collett. So in the case of identical twins, they will have the same genetic makeup, but we can still see that in comparison, the faces are actually different. And this is very important because it suggests to us that all faces are unique in some way, even though they may appear superficially similar. This is an interesting thing to consider from a forensic point of view, where we are absolutely concerned with distinguishing one person from another, because you don't want to arrest the wrong individual for a crime that they didn't commit, but it was committed by someone who looked very similar. And if we think about the quality of, say, some CCTV footage, if you took these two different individuals and put them under a CCTV camera that might be mounted very high on a wall, or the quality might be very grainy, and you were asked to do a facial analysis of these two faces and say whether they are the same person or which person is which, I think that would be extremely challenging. And what that suggests is that it is possible for people who look similar to be confused for one another. So while we might be genetically similar, we can look different. So let's take this one step further. These are celebrity faces. Some of them you might recognize. They're different people, but I think it's quite striking how similar different people can look. So in the top image, we've got Javier Bardem, Robert Downey Jr., and Jeffrey Dean Morgan. And if we think about these people in our mind's eye separately, we might not think that they look similar. But when you put them together, you can start to see how similar they in fact are. Likewise, Katy Perry and Zooey Deschanel. Likewise, Bono and Robin Williams. And likewise, Miley Cyrus and Justin Bieber. And that one's particularly effective with the diagonal split face. But I think it's important to also look closely and really think about, well, where does the similarity come from? Is it in individual facial features? Is it in general facial shape, or the layout of features on the shape, the proportions of our face? Or is it perhaps superficial? Like with Katy Perry and Zooey Deschanel, I think what makes those, it's less about those faces being similar than those images being similar. And the image is similar because they have very similar hairstyles and they have very similar makeup. But I think if you change those details, those superficial details, you might end up with people that actually do look much more different than they do look similar. So it's important to really scrutinize faces to find where they match and where they don't. Likewise, the same person can look very different. And this starts to help us to see that the face is not a fixed, stable form. The face changes over time. It changes according to different conditions. If we think about back to those identical twins I showed you, if you think that the one might go in the sun a lot, or smoke cigarettes, or drink alcohol, or not have a very healthy diet, it's very likely that those external lifestyle choices and external exposures will alter one's facial appearance. Here we've got some examples again of celebrities, and we use celebrities a lot here because there's just a lot of images out there on the internet. They're very photographed people. On the left, we've got Misha Barton at two very different body masses. So on the left, she looks considerably underweight, and on the right, she looks a much more healthy weight. But the alteration to her facial appearance is quite striking. In the case of Jennifer Grey, in the middle, she had rhinoplasty after she became a very well-known face. She was in the film Dirty Dancing, for example, and that has really altered her facial appearance, along with the natural processes of aging. Renee Zellweger, quite controversially, underwent some form of cosmetic intervention. She, I think, denied that she did, and I don't know why we just can't be honest about these things. But either way, whatever she did to her face, whether it was a temporary intervention or a surgical intervention, really did alter her facial appearance in a very dramatic way, to the extent that I've used this image in training sessions with law enforcement officials, and no one recognized her in the image on the right. But then when I put up the image on the left, there was obviously great surprise. So I think it's very interesting to think about these faces. Also that, everyone in this particular set of image also happens to be white women. So that is also a consideration. If we go back into history and to think about sort of important moments in the history of forensic identification, Alphonse Bertillon, a French bureaucrat, is often cited as being a very, very significant figure. So he was functioning in the 19th century in Paris, and he developed a system which is now known as Bertillonage, which is quite a complex series of measurements. It's referred to as anthropometric measurements, where he would measure different parts of the body. And his thinking was a combination of these different measurements, when put together, would only arrive at one person. Like, it would be statistically impossible to have a number of people who all share the same set of bodily measurements. So he was working with statistical probability here. And his system was very complex. It involved photography, this frontal and lateral imaging of the face, which we see to this day in police photography, shall we say, or even passport photography, legal photography. But his system became overly complicated with all of these measurements, although it was in action for some years in Paris. He also started to try and classify features of the face. So he was very interested in the creases in our foreheads when we frown, or as we age, that might distinguish us from another person. The creases between our eyes. I know I tend to wrinkle my forehead when I'm thinking, so I've definitely got the vertical crease lines between my eyes, and then other diverse wrinkles on the neck, on the ear, on the cheek, the what we call nasolabial folds, the creases that the lines that come down between the side of your nose and the corner of your mouth, the crow's feet wrinkles that we have on the side of our eyes, some of us, and then looking at corpulence, or basically body weight. Lots of kind of complicated geometries, facial landmarking, and then I'm very interested in this poster looking at the differences of the human ear, because as we will talk about in a minute, when we do facial reconstruction, it's very difficult, it's actually impossible to accurately reconstruct the shape of a human ear, because a human ear, like a fingerprint, is biometric. All of our ears are unique, and there's no way of knowing from the bony parts of the skull exactly what shape an ear is going to be. So this is very interesting, and in some kind of very specialized corners of forensic investigation, the biometrics of the ear prints are looked at comparatively. If someone leans against a pane of glass or a wall and to try and listen to something happening on the other side, that print can possibly be matched with the person whose ear that belonged to. But ears are very important biometric object. However, with Bertillon's system being so complicated, it wasn't long before fingerprints replaced the Bertillonage system, and fingerprints were largely promoted as a sort of colonial bureaucratic tool by the British Empire in India, interestingly, and really promoted by Sir Francis Galton, who was also very interested in statistical difference. But history hasn't been particularly kind to Sir Francis Galton because a lot of his interests in human difference actually tended towards eugenics or ideas about ideal humans. But that's a conversation for another day. This is a very interesting case, which is often cited to support fingerprinting and to not place too much emphasis on the face. So, as this article published by J. Edgar Hoover, who was once director of the FBI, the subtitle here is that Bertillon measurements are not always a reliable means of identification. And this is a case from the early 1900s, 1903, where a man called Will West was sent to prison at Leavenworth in Kansas. And a few days later was brought to the office because there was some problem that was found. And the problem was that in the same prison, coincidentally, I mean, you couldn't make this up. If you wrote the film script, no one would believe you. That there was a man in the same prison called William West. And this is Will and William West. These are their photographs. So they claim to not know each other. They claim to not even be related. I find this quite hard to believe, and it's possible that they were in fact twins and somehow separated at birth, or it's just a really uncanny coincidence. But here is Will and William West, and despite their similarities, when they were fingerprinted, there was a clear difference that could be seen in their fingerprints. And so this is a case that is often advanced and quoted as supporting the strength of fingerprinting as a forensic identification tool. But again, to go back to my point earlier, if we didn't have that fingerprinting, we would quite easily possibly mistake one Will West with William West. I mean, the fact that their names are so similar also adds complication. It's a very sensational story, but also very powerful, as it prompts a lot of questions in my mind, certainly. What we do know from forensic identification is that, and if we think about a situation where you might be an eyewitness to a crime, say, unfortunately, you are attacked, or you witness a robbery or an accident, and you see the perpetrator or the suspect who is involved, and you might be asked by the police to assist them in drawing up a facial composite of what this person looked like. We know that the face is very difficult to depict using words or memory alone. So if you're sitting with a forensic sketch artist, or now more likely a computer technician who's using a sophisticated software to generate the composite, you would probably struggle to think about that face in terms of individual features. And having tested this myself on someone I know, very well, I've lived with them for 22 years, I struggled. I couldn't produce an accurate depiction of their face using a piece of software. Now, partly this was a problem of memory, and partly it was a problem of not finding the right facial parts in the software package to accurately build the face. What you're seeing on the screen here is an old technology for facial compositing called Identikit, and this was, you would find different transparencies with different sets of eyes, nose, mouth, and you would work with a police artist to kind of put these together, assemble these into a face. But ultimately, these faces always look a little bit like Mr. Potato Head. There's much more sophisticated software now that uses evolutionary algorithms to effectively breed faces of similarity that you can then choose and adjust for different sort of qualitative features, such as do they look angry, do they look healthy, etc. So we've moved on quite far from these very basic Identikit processes, technologies. But I ran another test with some of my students to try and demonstrate how difficult it is to describe a face using words or memory alone. Now, in the case of both facial compositing and facial reconstruction, the forensic artist is expected to produce an image of a face that they can't see. Like it's not like a portrait where you might be drawing with the person sitting in front of you, or from a photographic reference. You're effectively producing a face out of nothing. Not necessarily nothing. Sometimes you've got a description of a face, and sometimes you've got a skull to work from. But that's all. The rest you have to produce to the best of your ability and with the best understanding of the science that supports these processes. So I ran an experiment with some of my students. And this is what they produced. So here we've got a number of drawings of essentially the same face. And the face, of course, is mine. How these drawings were produced was I was sitting behind a screen, so they couldn't see me. And these were students I'd never taught before. So they had never met me. They'd never seen me. And I asked a colleague to stand in front of me and describe what she saw in my face, and then these students would draw it based only on their description of me. So some of them you can see are actually really quite accurate. The one that's right next to me, the photograph of me on the left, is really very good. The one a few faces on, some are kind of wild and they're really funny. But I think what is the next step that I'm going to take with this experiment is to average all of these faces together. So take all of these drawings, put them in a piece of software that enables me to create a facial average. And I think what is going to happen is that all of the kind of crazy details that are not that accurate are going to be kicked out, and what's going to be left in the way that visual statistics work is a face that looks much more similar to my face than the fact that all of these look very different to my face. With forensic art, we are often faced with the case of people who die without an identity attached to them. Somehow in the process of death, they've become disassociated with their legal identity. And our role is to assist police investigations in bringing those two things together, this individual and their legal identity. Now, this is a person who is considered one of the most recognizable women in the world. Some of you may have seen this photograph online, some of you may have not. It is disturbing, I recognize, to see post-mortem images, but this is the subject matter that we're working with. But this is a very good example of how challenging it can be to recognize a post-mortem face. And it can be challenging for two reasons. The first reason is that the face undergoes immediate physical changes at the time of death. So the face becomes very altered in its appearance. Sometimes the deceased person can look very peaceful and sleeping, as if they're sleeping. But in other times, especially if there's trauma or violence at the time of death, the face can undergo some quite significant changes. However, when we think about the distress of seeing a dead person, and thinking that in forensic contexts, if someone is unidentified at death, but they suspect the identity and they can contact the family to conduct a visual identification, that is a very emotional and potentially traumatizing process for the family. So we need to also bear in mind that while the face might be difficult to recognize due to physical changes, it may also be very difficult to recognize because of the emotional burden associated with identifying deceased faces. So we, as forensic artists, try and apply our skills to create images of the dead as if they're alive in order to optimize the potential of recognition. So we're able to kind of reverse the effects of death, early stages of decomposition, facial trauma, etc., in order to present a living appearance of this individual. But I also think that this is probably of greater social benefit as well, because the families who come to the mortuary to identify their individual can possibly, or who might see images circulate in the media, it is optimal to look at an image of this person as if they're alive. It's also considered socially unacceptable to publish images of the dead. So in many cultures, and having this image on the screen for so long really is about asking you to think about, well, is it appropriate to look at images of the dead, and under what conditions? So now that you've had time to think about who this person might be, would you be surprised to know that it's Marilyn Monroe? And this really makes the point of how difficult it can be to recognize a post-mortem face, particularly when you see that it's someone like this who's an extremely photographed person and probably one of the most famous faces in the world. So it really supports, I think, the importance of doing research in this field in order to improve practice. If we think about human beings and human practices and the dead, we have been depicting the faces of the dead for thousands of years. But why would we do this? So the Jericho heads from around 6,000 to 7,000 BC suggest that there was an interest in over-modeling the skulls of the deceased in this particular community for ritual reasons, ritual practices. There are other examples from other ancient cultures around the world. But these Jericho skulls are quite beautiful. They involve clay and with inlaid eyes. We can also see a similar ritual preparation of the dead in ancient Egypt, and I'll get to an example in a minute. But we think about ritual practices being one reason. We also depict the faces of the dead for historical interest. So in this case, the example on the screen is Face Lab's depiction of Robert the Bruce of Scotland. these historical or archaeological depictions have increased in sophistication as technologies have increased and progressed. So while they may have originally been, a clay sculpture, now we're using digital sculpture and sophisticated computer graphics, not only to depict photorealistic 3D people from the past, but we might also be able to animate these faces. So historical interest is the second reason. The third reason is forensic identification. So the image on the screen is also a Face Lab case. This was broadcast on Crime Watch as a public appeal to identify this unidentified individual. And just to point out, so that you can notice here, that the forensic image is in black and white, whereas the historical depiction is in color. And I will talk a little bit more about that and why that is a little bit later. Just out of interest, we can think of another reason why we might be interested in depicting the faces of the dead, not only depicting the faces of the dead, but revising previous depictions of historical figures. And this is the case of Johann Sebastian Bach, a famous composer, who also happened to be the first subject of an anatomical reconstruction in 1895 by Hiss and Seffner. And then with increased scientific understanding and a better methodology, I would say, Professor Caroline Wilkinson and Janice Aiken, then at the University of Dundee in 2008, produced a more scientific reconstruction of Johann Sebastian Bach. And you can see the difference not only in the color, but in the treatment of the face and the presentation of the face in the later depiction. So why we might do this? Some of the reasons advanced include that facial reconstruction enables the humanization of remains. In the crafting of individuality, we can reintroduce a sense of personhood for these individuals. They move from being a specimen or an object back to a living, breathing, or an imagined living, breathing person. It also enables us, and particularly in the case of revised historical depictions, it enables us to examine our cognitive bias and to really think about real appearance versus the perception that we might have of people. And often our perception of people might alter or in some way influence how we perceive their face. And there was a very interesting campaign by Dove, the beauty product brand. They make soap, amongst other things, where they had the forensic artist Gil Zamora draw portraits of women. In the first portrait he would draw their face based on their description of themselves. And then in the second portrait he was drawing the same woman but described by someone else. And it was a very good example of how self-critical we can be about our own appearance and how other people perceive us in a much more attractive manner than we often perceive ourselves. So if you're interested in that, I'm sure you can find that online if you Google Gil Zamora Dove Beauty Campaign. Just to go back to our talking point about the renewed understanding of faces from the past, this is something of particular interest of mine, and this is an example of a project that we did as Face Lab with the Maidstone Museum in the UK, and there is an academic paper published about this project. Maidstone Museum has a mummy in their collection, an ancient Egyptian mummy, who was known as Takesh. And they received a grant to update the galleries in which this mummy was displayed, as they felt that the display was not particularly ethical or was outdated. And in part of this, the renovations of the display, it enabled a full and updated scientific analysis of Takesh, as well as a reinterpretation of the cartonnage from her coffin, detailed medical imaging, and a facial reconstruction. And this these images on the screen on the left is the mummy as she is in her current state, a depiction from the cartonnage, and then we move through the CT scan, me working on the facial reconstruction, my colleague Mark Ruffley, who produced the texturing and CGI of the facial reconstruction shape, and then all the way through to a detailed texturing, which was also animated in this case, as well as a 3D print of the reconstruction for visually impaired museum visitors to be able to experience Takush's face, because obviously we always prioritize the visual. But for those of us who can't see very well or can't see at all, that excludes them from this experience and this knowledge. So this was a wonderful and sensitive choice by the museum to really prioritize the experience and access across all levels of ability. And what I particularly liked about our collaborative discussions in this process was the choice not to render Takush as the 3D print, with, a human hair wig and, prosthetic eyes and paint her. I really like just keeping her as a translucent shape onto which we can imagine that she may have a skin tone that was slightly darker or slightly lighter than we would choose to put forward in the depiction. Like I've said, faces are not stable. They change over time. We also don't know that much about ancient Egyptians. We have a very rich visual culture to draw from, but we do know that population was very diverse. There were people with light toned skin, dark toned skin, and everything in between. So, the idea of Egypt that has been advanced, say, in the West, is of a very sophisticated ancient culture that are generally depicted with light skin. But Egypt was also, it is in Africa, and part of Egypt is what we now think about, always what is identified as Sudan, so the kind of perception of ancient Egyptians is one thing, but the reality of how they actually appeared may be another thing. And this project really enabled a kind of self-conscious questioning of all of those features. So, getting back to forensic facial imaging specifically, what is it? It's more commonly known as forensic art. However, these days, saying facial imaging practitioner or analyst is more accurate than forensic artist. And there are a lot of reasons for this, which we won't get into now. But artist is often considered less reliable than scientist, which is, again, a prejudice, but it is a reality. And my personal feeling is that there's such a range of practices that fit under the umbrella of forensic facial imaging and forensic art, that art is only one part of a certain set of practices. So it is more accurate and more inclusive to refer to facial imaging practitioner or facial imaging analyst, depending on the kind of work that you do. And I will show you in a minute how to think about these as sort of different but related practices. Also, as we have seen, is that not all facial depiction is forensic. We see many examples of archaeological reconstruction too. However, in forensic facial imaging, we have two main practices or objectives. So on the one hand, we have identification of the living, and on the other hand, we have identification of the dead. And there are different techniques and methods that we associate with either of these objectives. But then age progression is an interesting one because it's something that we are asked to do sometimes in the case of either missing adults or missing children. Missing children tend to not be missing of their own choice. It's usually a case of abduction or worse. However, adults are legally allowed to disappear themselves. They don't have to account for their whereabouts. But obviously that can cause concern sometimes to their families. But in some cases, we've also got adults who are fugitives. and there's a legal imperative to track them down. So age progression is interesting. It doesn't quite fit into either the identification of the living or the dead. We presume that it's identification of the living, but that is less of a question than the fact that it is less scientifically supported than any of the other techniques associated with identification of the living or the dead. It's a very challenging process to produce an age progression, and it really relies heavily on the available material. So I won't talk about that in too much detail, but if you're interested, you can always get in touch with me and I can explain a little bit more. So these are some techniques of forensic facial imaging, which I've just prepared some visual examples for you. This is craniofacial superimposition, and it's probably one of my favorite challenges, and that is where you might be asked whether an unidentified skull may or may not be a particular person. So this is a case of suspected identification, and your job when undertaking a craniofacial superimposition is to look for points of exclusion. And I would say that this is a general principle in any facial analysis discipline, is we're not looking to include. We're not looking to say this is this person, because in no way can you say with 100% confidence that it is or it isn't when you're only working with images. You also need to, I think, adopt a principle of it is always better to, in the case of suspects, it is better to preserve liberty than it is to falsely imprison somebody. So it's very important then to use the rule of exclusion to test what you're given against all possible points of exclusion. But in this case, these are two very famous cases of post-mortem identification using craniofacial superimposition. The case on the left is the case of Buck Ruxton, who murdered his wife and her maid. And this case lives on. It's quite a famous case in the northwest of England as well as Scotland, because it sort of took place, or it involved jurisdictions in the border region between the UK, or England and Scotland. What is interesting about this is it really gets into the meat of photographic images and the questions of sort of truth and accuracy, which is really what I love to talk about. And as we can see on the left, using Mrs. Ruxton's tiara as a way of creating a one-to-one scale between the portrait of her and the skull in order to create the accurate match. The case on the right is another very famous case where the craniofacial superimposition was used to support the plausible identification of an unidentified skull as being that of Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was an infamous Nazi scientist, war criminal, who had escaped Germany after the war and run away to Argentina, but then ended up drowning in Brazil. And his remains were discovered. What I like very much about this particular set of images is that it demonstrates the consistency of the bones of the face, so the skull, regardless of how an individual ages. So in the first image, you can see it's a young image of Mengele. In some of the other images, like here on the right, it's an older image of Mengele, but the facial proportions always remain consistent, while other superficial features might change as a face ages. So this is a wonderful and very, very challenging process to try and attempt. Then we have post-mortem depiction, which I've referred to already. Some agencies still produce post-mortem depictions as pencil or digital sketches, but the digital montage method, which is what is demonstrated in the slides below, is considered a best practice where you are retaining as much of the original image as possible. You can also clearly demonstrate your workflow, particularly if you're working in a program like Photoshop and you can demonstrate all the layers. It also allows for rapid adjustments and corrections. There are pros and cons to photographic realism. but that is a conversation for another day. Some people say that it makes the image too specific and then you might exclude possible recognition. Others say that if it's too realistic, that can be a little bit unsettling. But others really promote the photographic realism as really engaging our imaginations. We are interested in images that look very realistic versus those that are a little bit simpler in their presentation, in their visual style. So that's another way where the science of forensic facial imaging learns a lot from art and how we perceive visual images. Age progression I've already talked about a little bit. These are just some well-known, relatively well-known cases. The one on the left is particularly well-known. This was actually a forensic sculpture that was made. So the image, you've got these two faces. The front face is the actual person, John List, and the image, the face behind in profile, is the sculpture that was produced by Frank Bender. And so well did Frank Bender and his colleagues who worked on this case seem to understand the character and persona of this fugitive John List, that even their choice of eyeglasses that they dressed the sculpture with are almost perfect. So this is often a case that is used to advance the importance and the usefulness of age progression in the case of missing adult fugitives. In the middle image is a forensic age progression of Madeleine McCann, who is still missing. The British toddler who was abducted allegedly from a holiday resort in Portugal, and this is her age progressed to the age of 9, so what she might look like at the age of 9. And the image on the right-hand side is a fairly recent case that we did in FaceLab for the Netherlands Forensic Institute of a woman who has been missing for 46 years. And we only had a very, very low resolution and tiny photograph of her on her wedding day to work from. But it was possible to use this as a basis to build a more high resolution image of what she might look like. But what was most interesting and useful in this case is that she had very characteristic teeth, and it was possible to show her mouth slightly open to demonstrate that very characteristic feature, because we can't ever really be sure how accurate our images are at the texturing stage. And I will talk about the difference between facial shape and facial texture in more detail in a second. But if there is a characteristic feature that we can highlight in the depiction, it's possible that that feature alone may be enough to trigger recognition in someone. Versus paying attention to the less important superficial details that we can't be that confident about. And in this case, we could be absolutely confident of her teeth, knowing that she had not undergone any dental work, while she was still, in connection with her family. Of course, we can't possibly know what has happened subsequently, but it's still an important feature to bring out. And what was wonderful is that her daughter, who was involved in this case, obviously, also saw those teeth as being something that she remembered very well about her mother's face. So for her, this aged image of her mother, who she hasn't seen for nearly 50 years, is for her a very faithful rendering of her mother that also honored her mother in some respect. For her, it plays an important memorial role as well. So if we think about the method of facial reconstruction, or the practice of facial reconstruction, effectively, as it's developed over time, has two methods. So there's the atomical method and the American method. These methods, and I'll talk a little bit about their history in a second, but these methods differentiate themselves really in one key way. The anatomical method reconstructs all of the muscles of the face, or the major muscles of the face, should I say, as well as making reference to average tissue depth landmarks, those pegs you see all over the skull. But it really prioritizes individual skeletal anatomy. So what it does is it presumes that because each face is unique, each skull is unique, and because the skull provides the scaffold for the face itself, the facial bones provide the scaffold. If we pay attention, very close attention, to the features of that scaffold and we reconstruct the anatomy very carefully, we will arrive back at the basic facial proportions of the face that once sat over that skull. So, having said that though, you still have to add facial textures, hair, wrinkles, etc. to create a plausible face from that facial model. In the American method, as it was originally developed, no facial anatomy is reconstructed. Instead, this method prioritizes the average soft tissue landmarks that are organized as a series of measurements indicated by pegs placed at different places on the skull, and strips of clay are placed between those pegs to interpolate the difference and the kind of curvature in between the pegs, and so arrive at a final face. This also works. What it tends to do, however, is that it produces a more, as it would do because you're using average tissue data, it produces more of a facial type rather than a specific face. And then these facial models also have to be personalized or made more plausible by the addition of hair, wrinkles, etc. So as in the one you can see here, the hair has actually been sculpted with clay, as well as the eyebrows, detail around the lips, etc. So how this developed is really, I would say, 5 key figures. Firstly, in the early to mid-20th century, the Russian M.M. Gerasimov pioneered what is now known as the Russian or the anatomical method. He published a book, kind of like a memoir, I would say, in 1971 called The Face Finder, which is a really good read. But otherwise, some of his actual techniques are kind of lost to translation in that they mainly exist in Russian. But there have been some attempts recently to try and retrieve and republish some of his methods. So this is the early to mid-20th century. Then in the late 1960s, in the United States, we see the medical illustrator Betty Pat Gatliff working with the anthropologist Clyde C. Snow, and together they developed the American method, which was published in a scientific paper in 1970. But Betty Pat's work on the serial killer case of John Wayne Gacy, where a number of unidentified human remains were found buried in his basement in the crawl space underneath his house, really raised the public profile of facial reconstruction and Betty Pat's method in particular. However, forensic sculpture is a fairly time-consuming process. You've also got the problem of working directly on the skull, which is considered now to be absolutely an unethical thing to do. But then to make a faithful copy of the skull through a cast, what if the bones are fragile? There are lots of things to consider, which could introduce a lot of challenges to your ordinary law enforcement office. Also with, specific training and artistic skills, not your everyday police artist or doesn't necessarily have these skills. So Karen Taylor, also in the United States, in Texas, was mentored by Betty Pat Gatliff, and in the 1980s and 1990s, Karen was working for the Texas Department of Public Safety, and she developed a 2-dimensional method of facial reconstruction, which, assuming you took an accurate photograph of the skull under very controlled conditions and were enabled to reproduce that at a 1-to-1 scale with the landmark pegs already placed on the skull, it was possible to render an accurate reconstruction purely in drawing, which reduced the kind of logistical challenge of sculpture and enabled this work, as Karen suggests, to be done much more quickly, and also really exercised the skills of police sketch artists who were already making, say, facial composite sketches from eyewitness descriptions. It also enabled, as Karen has described to me, put away your work while you're busy if you need to then have a traumatized eyewitness come into your office to generate a sketch, and it may be distressing for them to see what your lab might look like, if you've got a half reconstructed skull on the table, etc. All of that can be quite distressing to people. So this two-dimensional method, you can do it effectively on a drawing board with tracing paper over it, and it makes it a very portable way of working as well. In the late 20th century, Richard Neve, working in Manchester, at the University of Manchester in the Unit for Art and Medicine, developed a method for manual sculpture which combined both the anatomical method with the American method, in the sense that the soft tissue markers are used as a guide, but individual facial anatomy is prioritized. And this is the method that's kind of considered best practice today, which has been extended into 3D virtual sculpture by Caroline Wilkinson and colleagues at the University of Dundee, and Professor Caroline Wilkinson is now running FaceLab at Liverpool John Moores University. So this is some key literature if any of you are really interested in the development of forensic art, or certainly facial reconstruction more specifically, which is really a super specialization of forensic anthropology. So we can see in the literature that has been published, it is a very interdisciplinary field. It draws a lot from what we understand of biological anthropology, but then with the additional aspect of the forensic, which simply means for the law. So here we are applying our skills in the service of legal investigations. And there's been a number of books published, both practical and technical for actual practitioners, textbooks for anatomists and anthropologists, and then those that start to tend towards a forensic facial identification, which is starting to separate itself out as a further specialization of the field. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So when we start a facial reconstruction, we have to first undertake a craniofacial analysis. And this is really a way of talking about determining certain features from the skull. So we'll be working closely with a forensic anthropologist who might have already undertaken a biological profile of the individual, determining both basic features and individual characteristics. The basic features include sex and ancestry, and I put a question mark there because both of those things exist on a spectrum. Increasingly, this is being recognized, but because of they exist on a spectrum, it can be quite challenging to say for sure if someone is male or female, or say for sure which population group they might derive from, because we exist on a spectrum. In some cases, it's very easy that the sexual dimorphism is very clearly articulated or expressed on the bones. But most of us, I would say, probably exhibit both male and female features. And, especially if we come from very diverse populations, our ancestry can be quite difficult to pinpoint. So those are things to bear in mind. But obviously, forensically, we do need to understand how someone might have presented themselves in life. And I hate to use the word race because it is a social construct and has no biological basis whatsoever. But police often think in terms of race. So they need to understand what this person might have looked like, how it fits into their categories of people. Other things we can determine is age at death and stature, as well as signs of pathology, signs of trauma, and facial features. So how we know this, and the kind of the basis for a lot of this data has come from medical imaging and how it's developed over time, with the most recent and best being computed tomography or CT imaging. And we then start to understand the relationship between the hard tissue and the soft tissue of the face, which those central images indicate some of the landmarking points, which are used across a range of fields, whether it's maxillofacial surgery, facial reconstruction, etc. There have also been some fairly reliable anatomical standards published that will allow us to predict fairly accurately the shape of different features. We understand the nose quite well now. We understand something about the mouth that has to do with dental occlusion, so we tend to work quite closely with dental literature. We also understand various things about the positioning and the appearance of the eye in relation to eyelid folds, if there's an epicanthic fold, the shape of the eyebrow, things like that. We also understand the eyes in relation to the mouth. The inner edges of your iris usually line up with the outer corners of your mouth. Not always, but usually. And we also understand something about the angle of the ear, whether ears have earlobes or not. But like I said earlier, the actual shape of ears is impossible to reconstruct at this stage. What we can't determine from the skull is actually quite a lot. So skin color, eye color, hair color and style, whether someone has facial hair or not, unless of course there's some preserved soft tissue, in which case that can give us a clue. Like I said, we can't tell ear shape. We also don't understand age-related skin changes from the bone alone, and also because we're all individuals, we may have been exposed to different things in our lives. But if we look at the images of, on the left, of Samuel L. Jackson on the top and Mick Jagger, these were taken when they were both of a similar age, and we can see that their faces are wrinkling in quite dramatically different ways. So, you know, whether we know that someone is 40 or 60 doesn't necessarily tell us what they might look like. And in forensic cases, age is often expressed as a range because it's very difficult to be precise. So someone might say this person is between the ages of 40 and 65, in which case you've got a very wide range of options to choose from in terms of how you present the depiction. Also from the bone alone, unless there's been alterations to the bone, we can't tell if someone had any body modifications that may have adjusted their soft tissue. We also can't tell anything about facial expression or personality. So all of that is quite a lot in terms of what makes a face a plausible face and a relatable face. How accurate is it? There have been a number of studies over more than 100 years, and we know that we can be accurate for approximately 70% of the facial surface within about 2 millimeters, so that's pretty accurate. But increasingly, technologies like cone beam tomography and other studies are increasing our understanding not only of accuracy in terms of facial shape, but we're also starting to understand that we need to distinguish between facial shape and recognition, so the texturing parts that really affect how plausible or relatable a face is. So we often say that with facial reconstruction, we can reach an approximate to good resemblance, but we always stress that facial reconstructions are not portraits. It's also important to understand that facial depiction is not the same as facial recognition. Facial recognition is now one aspect of facial identification that is becoming a separate discipline from forensic art. And facial recognition, to take it one step further, when we think about machine learning or computerized facial recognition, it is increasingly a machine learning project. It's considered to be more objective and less error-prone than human facial analysis. However, I think that this is a fallacy. And the research of someone like Joy Buolamwini, who I will introduce you to in the final slide, is really demonstrating this with her work, that these systems carry as much bias as humans do on the basis of the data that they're trained on. So if you only train a system on white faces, it won't be able to recognize faces of any other population affinity as well as it will be able to identify white faces, for example. So these systems also carry embedded bias, as we do as human beings. But it's important to understand that there are different processes to facial recognition. So as this little diagram demonstrates, the first question is there a face, yes or no? And then if yes, we can do one of two things. Either we identify or verify that is it a one-to-many search? So that police would often do this kind of search. Or is it a verification? So is this face the same as this face? Another process we might do is classify what type of face is it. And here, this is often the interest of cognitive psychologists and other disciplines where they want to understand how a face might carry certain information. So we discussed this right at the beginning of the presentation, but how faces communicate features including age, gender, perhaps, emotion, etc. So looking at the difference between forensic art and facial identification, we've gone through some of the methods and techniques of forensic art, so facial reconstruction, postmortem depiction, eyewitness composites, craniofacial superimposition, and age progression. And then on the other side of the line now that's being drawn between these, where this very broad practice is now being differentiated, we've got facial analysis and facial comparison as occupying this new realm of facial identification. The real difference between forensic art and facial identification is that facial identification must make a judgment. It must say, with some degree of confidence, whether this is or isn't the same person. It is inherently comparative in its work, whereas forensic art is not that. Forensic art is simply producing a facial image which we hope will assist an investigation to identify someone, whether that person is an unidentified deceased person or an as yet suspect that needs to be arrested for an alleged crime or certainly brought in for questioning. What is interesting is that facial analysis and facial comparison is now supported by a range of scientific standards, certain research into biometrics and computerization, and these standards and guidelines and kind of technological support is building up the evidential authority for facial identification. And what that means is that facial identification is accepted by courts. You can introduce it as evidence. However, forensic art is not evidence and should never be considered evidence. It will always remain investigative intelligence, so it assists an investigation to generate leads, right? However, eyewitness composites and craniofacial superimposition do currently occupy something of a gray area where there have been cases where they've been introduced as supporting or circumstantial evidence in court cases. Even though forensic art is not considered evidence, we can see from a number of examples, and these are just a few from the Unit of Art and Medicine and past and Dundee casework, and we can find many, many more examples online, that forensic art can be effective if it is approached according to best practice and with the proper training, scientific understanding, and a very good appreciation for its scope and limits of its work. Current best practice is a 3D digital workflow that doesn't affect the original skull in any way, because that is considered obviously not only important evidence but also human remains that require certain levels of great sensitivity and protection. So the workflow that we use and that we used in FaceLab and I'm using now at Stellenbosch University involves 3D scanning or other forms of digital imaging, so CT, which produces a 3D model, which we take into a 3D virtual sculpture software, which is operated with a haptic arm. So that device that my colleague Sarah is holding there enables you to feel what you're doing while you are remodeling the muscles and the skin of the face. And to make the point that I made earlier in respect of the differences between archaeological presentation and forensic presentation, we have a little bit more creative leeway with archaeological presentation because we can introduce color. We might have information from the archaeological record about clothing and dress. And because these images are appearing often in museums and they are designed to capture the imagination of the audience, of the public. There is some creative freedom and flexibility within reason in how we present archaeological depictions. In forensic cases, however, any introduction of detail, whether it's color, clothing, etc., that we can't scientifically justify, could possibly derail the possibility of that person being recognized. So we try and reduce any assumption as far as possible. So we know that there's no cognitive or perceptual difference in presenting an image in color or black and white when it comes to familiar face recognition. So unless we have information to the contrary, it's much safer to present these images in black and white, as you can see in that Crime Watch case on the screen. So this is a little demonstration of what facial reconstruction in geometric freeform looks like, with the additional complication of having no mandible. So often the mandible is the lower jaw, and the mandible might be missing in cases where only skeletonized remains have been retrieved, because it's the only bone of the skull that moves. It's articulated in your temporomandibular joint, and it might become separated from the skull, due to a number of factors, whether it's soil erosion or animal scavenging or, water or whatever it might be. So you might often only retrieve the cranium, which is the top part of the skull. And if you are to produce a facial reconstruction, you effectively need to reconstruct the mandible in order to produce the full face, which you can do using some complicated geometry, as those slides demonstrated, but this was a kind of speeded up process of sort of working back from a completed reconstruction to show you what it looks like when you don't have a complete skull, that it is still possible to reconstruct a full human face. So what is the future? It's already here, I would say. We can start to see how various apps on our phones enable us to change our gender presentation, our age. The baby face apps become very popular on Snapchat. Politically, it's quite scary that what are known as deep fakes are becoming increasingly sophisticated. So this video of ex-US President Barack Obama is not in fact Barack Obama. It's an actor with sophisticated facial imaging that's made to appear to be Barack Obama. But face filters, in terms of how we communicate on social media, have become very popular. But I'm particularly interested in something called deep nostalgia, I think it's called, which has taken social media by storm, where and has been used to animate facial reconstructions of historical figures, using this technology, which was designed to, as they say, breathe life into family photos. So where you can take a still image and this very realistic, more realistic than any other similar animation options I've seen before, introduces blinking, slight movements of the eye, and very subtle facial expressions into otherwise still images, which creates an obviously much more lifelike presentation of a person. other big question within the field now is faces from DNA. So this is where we start seeing some very interesting parallels between art and science. Particularly for me, being interested in the interface between art and science, I was really interested in this project by Heather Dewey-Hagborg of some years ago now called Stranger Visions, where she started to produce facial images from DNA profiles that she processed from chewing gum she would pick up on the sidewalk, or cigarette butts, or a piece of hair. And this is her holding the depiction of her own face, produced using the methods that she developed and her own DNA profile. Her project is very speculative. Her project asks questions about privacy, about how much information really represents us. You know, in the past we might think that a facial photograph is the legal representation of ourselves. Now we're finding this translated into biological matter. And this is an interesting artistic speculation, but what is quite alarming is that it's now also being tested. It has been tested pretty much in parallel in science, and I'm not sure which came first, who was the egg and who was the chicken in this case. But while this also remains largely speculative from a scientific point of view, the really scary thing is that it is already being offered as a service for law enforcement. So this little news clip on the left demonstrates the difference between a traditional police suspect sketch and the kind of image that, in this case, Parabon Nanolabs, what they call DNA photo fitting, their snapshot technology can produce. And in this case, they can also use this technology to produce facial reconstructions for unidentified deceased people, as much as they can also produce a facial composite of a suspect based on, say, a DNA sample taken from a crime scene where there was a sexual assault, for example. I am at this stage unsure about where this is going to go. I'm very excited about the fact that DNA analysis can allow me as a forensic artist to be more confident about eye color and hair color, for example. But I do worry that we place a lot of importance on DNA identification, and I worry that people might perceive these images as being more accurate than they actually are, just because there's been DNA involved somehow in their presentation. I do know that at this stage, this particular company uses a forensic artist to interpret the findings. So right now, there isn't that much difference between what they're doing and what we would do without this information, but it has this added authority because of its association with DNA. So that's just an important sort of proviso, I think, to bear in mind. Then where I think the future might be really heading is that we need to engage what I refer to as citizen allies in our work to increase awareness of the crisis of unidentified remains around the world, and their particular hotspots in the globe where people unfortunately do die without being identified. And this is particularly true in countries or regions where there's a high level of undocumented human migration. So the border between South America and North America, Mexico and the United States in particular, the Mediterranean Sea, where refugees from Africa and the Middle East might attempt to cross into Europe, for example, and my own context of South Africa is currently experiencing an absolute crisis of about 10,000 unidentified individuals in our medico-legal system every year. So there's a real urgency and I think a human rights question to address this. And there's some very inspirational projects that I've researched around the world, and all of them involve people I'm very privileged to know that have been showing some success when we engage people with an interest who haven't been able to access forensic art as a training skill before, and where, in a relatively short space of time, under very, very strict and rigorous instruction and careful presentation of the images, some successes have been recorded. There's a very important point about remediation as well, which I think is important, which goes to the point of the importance of skills, training, and understanding how images perform, the work that images do. So this is a case of an unidentified individual in Scotland. This depiction was circulated for a year with no response. A revised depiction was then made by a colleague at the University of Dundee. Because there was enough information associated with this case to render the image in color, he chose to do so because this person had quite characteristic coloring, a kind of reddish ginger facial hair, as well as tattoos, personal effects, and clothing, all of which were reconstructed in this very sophisticated, almost 3D photographic rendering. And this was almost immediately identified and then confirmed with familial DNA. So the first image circulated for about a year with no response. The second image got a response almost immediately. There are a number of reasons for this, but mainly it's because my colleague at the University of Dundee understood the distortion to the face that was introduced in the original police photograph. Police photography is notoriously unstandardized. So you can see the difference in facial proportion and shape that has been introduced in the revised depiction, which is a more accurate rendering of this person's facial appearance, with obviously the additional information of color, clothing, and personal effects and individual marks, such as the tattoos. But all in all, a wonderful success story eventually. I'm interested in how we can speed this process up and allow it to happen sooner. Another thing that I'm working with some colleagues on is I'm very privileged to be a volunteer with the Transdo Task Force. And one of the things which might be considered a very minor issue in these cases, but actually isn't, it's just we don't talk about it enough, is the case of gender non-conforming people, and how if you're gender non-conforming, you might be misgendered in a missing persons or a forensic investigation, and which may affect the depiction of you that then gets put out into the world. So this is a case of Julie Doe. It's currently under reinvestigation. Julie Doe remains were found in 1988, and this very, very basic sketch was produced by an unknown person, we're presuming a police artist, in Florida in the United States. Re-examination in 2015 suggested that Julie Doe was a transgender woman. And this produced this next reconstruction, which I think is a little bit unfair because all of the associated information that we know about Julie Doe from the human remains themselves and features of those human remains, such as she was found partially mummified, so there was some element of preservation, long manicured fingernails, silicone breast implants, etc., suggested that Julie Doe was a female presenting woman who would pass as female and was possibly living as a female for a very long time due to the indication of exogenous hormones that had impacted on her skeletal remains. However, the forensic artist chose to produce this extremely masculine-looking image, which I think is probably an indication of some implicit bias on his part. So I'm happy to say that the forensic artist, an amateur forensic artist, Carl Koppelman, has produced a much more sensitive rendering of Julie Doe, and we're hoping that that she will be identified through forensic genealogy if it's possible to still extract a viable DNA sample from her remains. So this issue of representation in death is really important, particularly for those members of our community who might experience prejudice in their life and then will be doubly prejudiced against in death. So this is something I feel very strongly about. It's a very important aspect of social justice for myself. So we can see that, you know, where we might be play around with apps on our phones, these apps, it's a certain technology, artificial intelligence technology, might also be very useful for us in forensic facial depiction. So in the case of Julie Doe, the Face app allows the different depictions of her to be taken through a spectrum of male presenting to female presenting and everything in between, which also supports the idea that, you know, a transgender person specifically will appear different to different people at different stages of their lives, because of course in the case of Julie Doe, born male, transitioning to female, there would have been a spectrum of appearance in the intervening years, and people who encountered her at different stages of her life might have a different image of her in their minds. So it may be useful, in fact, to present a series of images of a single face rather than a single facial image. And we can see this relatively controversial experiment using Artbreeder, which is a generative adversarial network technology, to introduce photographic texturing to forensic sculptures produced in a workshop with active cases from the RCMP. Why this is controversial is that while the technology offers great promise, the textured images actually alter the facial features in ways that we within the forensic field would regard as unacceptable. So it's very important to only sort of think about this as an experimental gesture, and in no way does it improve necessarily the actual forensic sculptures which were produced under fairly rigorous scientific standards, following rigorous scientific standards. So as a final note, I would just really like you to think about selfie culture. And if we think that in mid-2016, Google had reported that 24 billion selfies had been uploaded to Google Photos in the past year, what does this mean? I mean, obviously, that was mid-2016. We're sitting in early 2021, so we can just imagine that that 24 billion is a much greater number now. So what is being done with this information that we are offering up to the internet for free? A lot of it is being used effectively to train facial recognition systems, to train computer vision software. But like I've already mentioned, this is not being done equally. Thankfully, we have artists who know this and who are using their skills to point out some of the inequalities of computer vision systems in the ways that it might perpetuate inequality, perpetuate prejudice, affect our ability to preserve personal privacy, for example. So the image in the middle is a wonderful project by Adam Harvey from 2010 called CD Dazzle, where he developed very interesting hairstyles and makeup, unconventional makeup designs that, if painted on your face, would make you unrecognizable to a facial recognition system. One specific one. One specific algorithm. It's important to recognize that he tested this only on one specific algorithm, and it may not be true of others, but what is for me interesting about his approach is that there's a great paradox, right? So while you might become unrecognizable to a computer eye, computer vision, you're obviously extremely recognizable because you've got a mad hairstyle and crazy shapes on your face. So there's a wonderful paradox there which points to both the seriousness of his proposition, but also the artistic playfulness involved in what he's doing. And then I mentioned her earlier, but Joy Bolamwini is a fantastic researcher from MIT. She's established something called the Algorithmic Justice League, and she is really a social activist using her skills in computer engineering to advocate for equality and privacy online within the artificial intelligence space. There's a documentary that's just been released about joy called Coded Bias. There's a wonderful TED Talk. So I would really recommend that you look into Joy Boylamwini, as well as Adam Harvey and a number of other artists who are really taking on this challenge of the face as a technology, both of identity and of identification. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you learned something in this session about forensics and the face, which obviously is a much bigger picture and doesn't only stick within the forensic field, but touches on art and science and various other things. And I hope that it is a good contribution to the Interface project that I'm very privileged to be a part of. So thank you very much. There's some links on the screen. You're more than welcome to reach out to me, and if I can answer any of your questions about the face in relation to forensic identification or just the face in general, I will do my best, and it would be lovely to hear from you. So thank you very much.